The dark secret of dirty gold. A curse worse than death. Hook. What happens when the thirst for gold turns into an unbreakable curse? Dive into the chilling tale of a man who enters a cave searching for riches, only to discover a darkness that devours everything, including his soul. Will he escape, or will he become another whisper in the shadows? Watch until the end to uncover the terrifying truth. The cave entrance yawned before him, dark and foreboding. Cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of damp earth. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. The light from his torch flickered, casting long, strange shadows on the walls. He squinted into the darkness ahead. The deeper he went, the more oppressive it became. Every step echoed. The silence was suffocating. A faint rustle sounded somewhere in the distance. He froze. Was it an animal? Or something worse? His pulse quickened. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The smell of something metallic began to linger. A distant clink rang out, followed by a low groan. His heart skipped. Something was alive down here, but it wasn't natural. He advanced slowly, cautiously. His hand trembled around the torch. The beam of light bounced off something glittering in the distance. Gold. A pile of it. Gold coins. Gold jewelry. It piled up like a twisted treasure trove. He stepped closer, eyes widening in disbelief. This wasn't just gold. It was dirty. Dirty gold. He could see the tarnish, the grime, the fingerprints of greed. It didn't shine. It oozed a sickly glow. There was something wrong with it. Something deeply wrong. He knelt beside it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. A low whisper curled through the air. A voice. No, it wasn't a voice. It was something worse. He jerked back, his heart pounding in his chest. The pile of gold shifted. It wasn't the weight. It was alive. It moved again as if breathing. A horrible, writhing mass. His throat tightened. He couldn't breathe. The ground beneath him groaned. The walls of the cave seemed to close in. His pulse hammered in his ears. He spun around, but the tunnel had changed. It wasn't the same anymore. It had never been the same. The passage narrowed. The light from his torch barely cut through the gloom. He ran, but his legs felt like lead. The walls seemed to shift, bend with malicious intent. Something was behind him. He could feel it. He could hear it. A low scraping sound, like claws against stone. The gold, he hadn't left it behind. He was running with it now, carrying it, tainting himself. The scent of metal and decay filled the air. With every step, the weight of it grew heavier. It burned his hands. He stumbled. The walls were closing in faster. He had to escape, but the way out was gone. The tunnel twisted around him like a living thing. He couldn't see the end, couldn't hear anything but the echo of his breath. The gold, it was everywhere now. On the walls, on the floor, in the air. A flood of gold. Dirty, cursed gold. And the darkness swallowed him whole. His chest tightened. The air was thick, suffocating. He couldn't escape. The gold was pressing in on him. Whispers swirled around him, close, almost intimate. He reached out, trembling, his fingers brushing against the gold. It burned. His skin tingled, then stung, then blistered. He recoiled, but the gold didn't let him go. It clung to him, wrapped around his fingers, pulling him closer. He fought, struggling to break free. But the more he fought, the deeper it sank into his skin. It felt like claws, like teeth, digging in, tearing him apart. The whispers grew louder, familiar now. They were voices. Voices from the past, from the men who had once sought this cursed treasure. The greed, the desperation, it hadn't died. It had only multiplied. He could hear their agony, their madness. The same fate waiting for him. He stumbled forward, his legs giving way. But the tunnel wasn't there. It had vanished. The walls, the path, it was all gone. He was trapped in a hollow void, a cold, endless blackness. The gold clung tighter. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed whole. No one would hear him. Not here. Not anymore. The air hummed with malevolent energy. Something was watching. Something was waiting. A presence far older than him, than anything on earth. The gold wasn't just metal. It was a curse, a living thing, feeding on souls. He realized, too late, that he was already one of them. A part of the madness, a part of the treasure's hunger. The walls whispered again, louder now, repeating his name. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't escape it. It was over. The gold had claimed him. His body trembled, his mind fighting to hold on to whatever remnants of reality remained. The whispers were louder now, the voices overlapping. They spoke of greed, of ambition, of forgotten men who had fallen before him. And now his name would join theirs. He could feel the gold burrowing deeper, crawling under his skin like 1,000 tiny insects. It was suffocating. The coldness spread through him, a numbing, unnatural chill. His legs gave way entirely. He fell to the ground, the weight of his own body dragging him down. The gold shifted, like it had a life of its own. It moved in sync with his every desperate breath. It seemed to pulse with a rhythm now, as if it was alive, feeding on his fear. His vision blurred, a haze of darkness and flickering light. The torch, once steady, now barely held onto its flame. He could hear it, faintly, something scratching at the edges of his awareness. A new voice? No, the same voices, only now they were pleading, begging, to be free, to be released. But he couldn't. He had no power. He was already a part of it, part of the endless hunger of the cave. His breath came in short gasps now, shallow, labored. The walls closed in again, but this time he couldn't move. He was chained, trapped in the thick, choking darkness. The gold was everywhere, suffocating him. He couldn't tell where it began and he ended. He wasn't sure where his body stopped and the treasure began. It was all one now, an endless writhing mass. He could feel his mind slipping, the last threads of clarity unraveling. He heard the deep, satisfied growl of the cave, as though it had consumed another soul. And then everything went still. The voices quieted. The weight of the gold lifted. For a brief moment he felt free, but it was only the stillness before the storm. The darkness would claim him again. He would join the others. A nameless whisper, lost to the curse. The cave would wait for the next. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. It wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of something waiting, something patient. Then the walls seemed to pulse again. A tremor, so slight at first, that he almost thought it was his imagination. But it wasn't. The ground beneath him shifted. The gold stirred, its cold touch seeping through his limbs. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. His body felt heavier. It wasn't just the weight of the gold anymore. It was the weight of time itself. He had been down here too long, far too long. A single beam of light pierced through the darkness, faint but undeniable. It was coming from above, from the cave entrance, the same entrance he had entered through. It couldn't be, but he felt a strange pull towards it, a strange desire to see the world outside again, to escape. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. The gold had sunk too deep. He could feel it like chains around his bones. The voices rose again, a chorus of mournful cries, begging for release. Their sounds echoed in his skull. They were everywhere. His body shook, not from cold, but from the sheer terror of the thought. He wasn't just trapped in the cave. He was becoming part of it, part of the gold, part of the curse. The whispering voices grew more frantic. He could hear them now clearer than before. They were calling to him. They were him. He had become one of them. He could almost see their faces, twisted with madness and agony, eyes wide with desperation, locked in an eternal prison. They had been searching for the exit, just like him. But there was no escape. Only more darkness, more hunger, and the gold. The gold was the key, the lock, and the prison. It was the only truth left. The light above flickered again. A brief moment of hope. But hope was a cruel thing in this place. He knew it. The gold pulled tighter. His skin burned as it continued its slow, agonizing creep through his veins. He was becoming part of the cave, part of its cursed treasure. And as the light above faded into nothingness, he understood. There was no escape. Only the endless waiting for the next desperate soul to arrive. The light vanished, swallowed by the consuming darkness. The silence returned, heavier than before. But something had changed. The air was thicker now. It felt alive. The walls seemed to pulse, like the slow, steady beat of a heart. The gold whispered, its voice lower now, almost soothing. It wrapped around him, tender in its grasp. But he knew better. It was a lie, a trap. The voices, once frantic, had quieted down to a distant murmur. They were waiting, watching, trapped in their endless loop. The cave had claimed them all, and now it would claim him. He could feel the cold seep deeper into his bones. His breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick, choking him. The whispers grew louder again, but this time they weren't begging for release. They were mocking him. He could almost hear their laughter, low and guttural, as they reveled in his fate. They knew. They had always known. The gold wasn't a treasure. It was a prison, a cage for the soul, a corrupting force that spread its rot with every touch. He tried to move again, to stand, to run. But the gold held him down, its grip tightening with every desperate pull of his limbs. The walls seemed to close in faster now. The passage he had once walked through, searching for fortune, was now nothing but a memory, a cruel mockery of his foolishness. A crack in the stone appeared before him, a narrow opening, just wide enough for him to squeeze through. Hope flared, bright and painful. He could escape. The exit was there, waiting for him. But as he reached for it, his fingers brushed against the cold surface of the gold again. And the moment he touched it, the ground beneath him shifted violently. The crack slammed shut. The walls trembled with a deep, bone-rattling growl. It wasn't over. It would never be over. He was back where he started, locked in the endless grip of the cave's hunger. And the gold, it was alive, alive and watching, waiting for its next victim. The ground beneath him shook again, harder this time. The walls seemed to ripple, as if the cave itself was breathing, alive. He could hear it now, the deep, reverberating sound of something massive moving just beneath the stone. The whispers had returned, louder and more frantic. They were not just voices anymore. They were a chorus of tortured souls, their cries growing in intensity. The gold, no longer a silent weight, throbbed with a sickly pulse. It wrapped tighter around him, binding him to the cold stone. He could feel the cave's hunger clawing at his insides. It was more than the gold. It was the cave itself, alive, sentient, and ravenous. His body had grown numb, but he could still feel the presence pressing against him. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something darker, something ancient. He couldn't breathe. His chest ached. Every movement felt sluggish, like the air had thickened to the point where he couldn't escape it. And then, as if the very earth was mocking his struggle, he felt a tug, a light pull at the back of his mind. It wasn't the gold. It was something else, something waiting just beyond his reach. A pull toward the deeper heart of the cave. It was as though the cave was calling him, offering him something tempting. But he resisted. He tried to pull back, to ignore it. But the pull was relentless, seeping into his thoughts, growing stronger with every passing second. It spoke to him in his mind now, a soft, alluring voice, the same whisper he'd heard before. "Join us." The words coiled around his thoughts like a snake, tightening. The gold around him pulsed in agreement. He didn't want to hear it, but he couldn't stop himself. He was part of this now. He had always been part of it. The hunger had already consumed him, body and soul. And he realized with growing horror that he wasn't just trapped in the cave. The cave was in him. It had always been in him. The pull grew stronger, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The gold shifted, alive beneath his skin. He could feel it now in every fiber of his being. The voices didn't whisper anymore. They screamed, but their screams weren't of terror. They were of triumph. They had become one with the cave. And now, so would he. He stepped forward, or at least he thought he did. His body no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the cave, to the gold, to the hunger. And as the cave closed in around him, there was no escape. Only the endless, suffocating wait for the next soul, the next lost one. The air was thick with darkness, suffocating. His limbs moved without his command, as though the cave itself guided him. Each step felt like sinking into something deeper, darker. The gold, still wrapped around his body, pulsated, like a heartbeat of its own. The voices were no longer just whispers. They were his thoughts now, mingling with his own. He could feel them twisting inside him. They were hungry. They were desperate. And now they were him. His eyes burned from the dim light that flickered faintly from the depths. The path ahead narrowed, the walls closing in, squeezing the air out of his lungs. There was no turning back. The cave was no longer just a place, it was alive. He could hear the soft scraping of something just beyond his reach, something crawling toward him, something ancient and powerful, a sound that had been buried beneath the stone for centuries, perhaps longer. The gold seemed to respond, as if it knew the creature was close. The weight in his chest grew, as though the very air was being drawn toward that distant, crawling sound. He wanted to scream, but his voice was gone, swallowed by the cavern, lost in its endless hunger. With every step, the dark presence grew stronger, more palpable. He could feel it now, close enough to touch, a dark shadow creeping just at the edge of his vision. A cold, clammy sweat covered his skin, mixing with the dampness of the cave. The walls pressed in tighter, until he couldn't tell where the stone ended and his skin began. It was like being swallowed whole, piece by piece. And then, as he stumbled forward, something moved in the darkness, a shape, shifting and unnatural. It was large, far larger than anything that should have fit in the cave. It seemed to coil and uncoil in the shadows, a slithering mass of darkness. His breath caught in his throat. The creature was here. It had always been here. It was the heart of the cave, the true master of the gold, of the curse. The whispers had always come from it, not from the gold. The gold was just its tool, its lure. And now it turned toward him. Its eyes were like pools of inky blackness. No light could escape them. It had no face, no form, but its presence consumed everything. He could feel it inside him, twisting with the voices. The hunger, the endless hunger that had once been his own, was now his prison. The cave had claimed him, and as the darkness enveloped him, as he felt his mind shatter and his soul slip away, he understood. There was no escape, no way out, only the endless waiting, the eternal hunger, and the gold. The gold would never stop. It would always claim the next. And the cycle would continue. The darkness closed in like a heavy blanket, suffocating and relentless. He felt the cold, the sharp sting of the cave's grip tightening around him. The creature moved closer, its presence filling every corner of the space. It wasn't just in front of him. It was inside him, inside his thoughts, inside his very soul. He couldn't escape it. The gold around him began to shift, as though it had a mind of its own, sinking deeper into his skin, feeding on his fear. The pulse of it thrummed through his body like a second heartbeat. Each throb pushed him further into the abyss, into the creature's waiting embrace. He could feel the weight of it, heavier now, like the cave was feeding on him. The voices were all around him again, louder, no longer whispers. They were calling to him, but they were no longer familiar. They were twisted, distorted, their sounds scraping his mind raw. He could hear them begging, crying for release, for escape. But he knew there was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone who came seeking the gold. The gold had no end. It consumed everything in its path, leaving nothing but madness behind. And now it was his. He was part of it. He had always been part of it. The creature's presence was closer now, suffocating him with its weight. It wasn't just an entity, it was the cave itself. It was the embodiment of the curse, a thing that had existed far longer than anything in the world above, a thing that had fed on greed, on desperation, on those who sought fortune but found only doom. He could feel its breath now, a low, rasping sound, like a whisper of wind through ancient stone. And then the gold shifted again, pressing against him from all sides. It was no longer just a weight. It was a force pulling him down, dragging him further into the darkness. His limbs moved of their own accord, as though they were no longer his. The creature, the cave, the gold, it had taken him. And there would be no more freedom, no more escape, only the hunger, only the endless cycle of those who came before him and those who would follow. The gold would always call. It would always wait, and the cave would never let go. He had become one with the darkness, a part of the curse that would never be broken. And as the last flicker of his consciousness slipped away, he realized with sickening clarity, the gold had claimed him. And it always would. The last remnants of his consciousness flickered like a dying flame. He could no longer tell where he ended and the darkness began. The cave's grip was complete now, tightening around his mind and body until nothing remained of the man who had entered seeking fortune. Only the hollow echo of the cave remained, a cruel whisper of something ancient and endless. He was a part of it, a part of the gold, a part of the hunger, and in the silence, something shifted. It wasn't the cave or the creature. It was something far more insidious. The pull of the gold, of the curse, began to reach beyond him, beyond the walls. It called to those who would come next. It waited. The voices, now a chorus of torment, grew quieter, faded into a dreadful lullaby. He could almost hear them now, those who had fallen before him, lost in the same trap. Their cries had become part of the cave's eternal hum, a part of the gold's twisted song. And he understood. The cycle was endless. It never stopped. Every soul drawn into the cave's embrace added to the hunger. Every soul lost to the gold fed its insatiable need. And as he drifted deeper into the cave's unrelenting darkness, the weight of the gold still pressing against him, he knew one thing for certain. The gold wasn't just a treasure. It was a calling, a curse, and no one who sought it could ever escape. The hunger would always find them, and they would be consumed just as he had been. The cycle would continue. Endlessly, the darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. Time no longer existed. The cave had swallowed it whole, along with the last fragments of his sanity. The gold still pulsed around him, throbbing with an unnatural rhythm. It was as though it was waiting for something, for someone else, a new soul, a new victim. The hunger had never stopped, and now it seemed to reach further, stretching beyond the confines of the cave itself. He could feel it in the air, in the cold breath of the earth. It was calling again, drawing closer, a magnetic force that no one could resist. But he was beyond resistance now. He had been claimed, and with each heartbeat, each breath, he became more a part of it. The gold whispered his name, now his only companion. Its voice had grown deeper, richer, like the growl of something ancient, something eternal. It wasn't just metal. It was a part of the cave, a part of the hunger that had lived long before him. And now it was in him, twisting through his veins. His thoughts were no longer his own. He was a mere vessel, empty and waiting, ready to become one with the next unfortunate soul. As the darkness stretched, far beyond his vision, he felt a new presence, a figure, faint at first, emerging from the shadows. It was as if the cave itself was birthing something new, a shape moving slowly, purposefully. It was a man, or had been. Now he was a mere shell, his body twisted and broken, his face hollow with madness. Another soul lost. Another victim of the cave's insatiable thirst. The figure walked towards him, his eyes empty, his expression blank. And then the thing reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed against the gold. For a moment, there was silence. Then the gold began to hum. Louder, faster. The cave itself trembled, as if the earth itself was groaning in response. And then the thing's face twisted into something familiar. It was his own face, his own eyes. The gold had claimed him completely. He was part of the cave now, part of the endless cycle of greed, of hunger, of eternal darkness. The thing became him. And as the walls of the cave closed in, his last thought was not his own. It was the cave's, waiting, hungry, everlastingly patient. For the next soul to step into its grasp, the silence stretched, broken only by the low hum of the gold that pulsed like a heartbeat. It filled the cave with its sickly rhythm, the sound of something alive, something ancient. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as the walls seemed to press in tighter. The darkness felt heavier now, as though it was waiting, watching. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, in his bones, the unbearable pressure. It was the hunger, the same hunger that had claimed him, the same hunger that had claimed every soul before him. It was relentless, endless. He was no longer sure where the gold ended and he began. His fingers, once trembling, now felt cold and numb, but the weight of the gold was still there. He could feel it deep inside him, as though it was part of him. The whispers had stopped for a moment, and in that brief silence he could hear the slow, steady echo of his own breathing. But it wasn't just his breath. It was the breath of the cave. The air was thick with the promise of something terrible, something far worse than death. He looked around, but the walls were closing in, narrowing the path, as though they were shifting and alive. The cave was changing, adapting, reacting to his presence. And then the light flickered. For a moment, just a brief instant, he saw something. A figure, a man, or had been. The figure staggered forward, eyes hollow, skin pale, stretched tight over bone. It wasn't human anymore. It was one of them, one of the lost, a soul forever trapped by the cave, twisted into something unrecognizable. The figure's mouth opened, but no words came out, only a low, rattling breath. And then the figure reached for him. The gold seemed to react, vibrating violently. The whispering grew louder, now a deafening roar in his mind. "Join us." The figure's hand was cold, impossibly cold, as it touched his arm. And in that instant, the truth hit him like a crashing wave. There was no escaping. Not from the gold, not from the hunger, not from the cave. He was now a part of it, trapped in an eternal loop, bound to the darkness. And as the figure's face twisted into a grotesque mirror of his own, he realized, with sickening clarity, that the cycle would never end. The cave would wait, hungry for the next. The whispers had quieted, but the gold still hummed in the deep, quiet dark. It was a soft, insistent rhythm, like the pulse of something vast and endless. The weight of it pressed against him, not just physically, but in his soul, sinking deeper with each passing moment. He couldn't tell where the cave ended and he began. It had taken everything, his thoughts, his breath, his essence, and now he was a part of it, a part of the hunger that had existed long before him, long after him. The darkness seemed to stretch forever, but somehow there was a calm now, an eerie stillness that washed over him like a cold wave. The gold had settled into him, its pressure no longer painful, but a constant, steady presence in his veins. He was one with it, one with the cave, everlastingly patient. For the next soul to step into its grasp, the silence stretched, broken only by the low hum of the gold that pulsed like a heartbeat. It filled the cave with its sickly rhythm, the sound of something alive, something ancient. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as the walls seemed to press in tighter. The darkness felt heavier now, as though it was waiting, watching. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, in his bones, the unbearable pressure. It was the hunger, the same hunger that had claimed him, the same hunger that had claimed every soul before him. It was relentless, endless. He was no longer sure where the gold ended and he began. His fingers, once trembling, now felt cold and numb, but the weight of the gold was still there. He could feel it deep inside him, as though it was part of him. The whispers had stopped for a moment, and in that brief silence he could hear the slow, steady echo of his own breathing. But it wasn't just his breath, it was the breath of the cave. The air was thick with the promise of something terrible, something far worse than death. He looked around, but the walls were closing in, narrowing the path, as though they were shifting and alive. The cave was changing, adapting, reacting to his presence. And then the light flickered. For a moment, just a brief instant, he saw something. A figure, a man, or had been. The figure staggered forward, eyes hollow, skin pale, stretched tight over bone. It wasn't human anymore. It was one of them, one of the lost, a soul forever trapped by the cave, twisted into something unrecognizable. The figure's mouth opened, but no words came out, only a low, rattling breath. And then the figure reached for him. The gold seemed to react, vibrating violently. The whispering grew louder, now a deafening roar in his mind. "Join us." The figure's hand was cold, impossibly cold, as it touched his arm. And in that instant, the truth hit him like a crashing wave. There was no escaping, not from the gold, not from the hunger, not from the cave. He was now a part of it, trapped in an eternal loop, bound to the darkness. And as the figure's face twisted into a grotesque mirror of his own, he realized, with sickening clarity, that the cycle would never end. The cave would wait, hungry for the next. The whispers had quieted, but the gold still hummed in the deep, quiet dark. It was a soft, insistent rhythm, like the pulse of something vast and endless. The weight of it pressed against him, not just physically, but in his soul, sinking deeper with each passing moment. He couldn't tell where the cave ended and he began. It had taken everything, his thoughts, his breath, his essence, and now he was a part of it, a part of the hunger that had existed long before him, long after him. The darkness seemed to stretch forever, but somehow there was a calm now, an eerie stillness that washed over him like a cold wave. The gold had settled into him, its pressure no longer painful, but a constant, steady presence in his veins. He was one with it, one with the cave. The cycle had swallowed him whole, and for the first time, he understood what it meant. He wasn't just lost in the darkness, he was part of the cave's heartbeat, a whisper in the shadows, a faint echo of those who had come before, who had fallen to the same trap. The hunger wasn't a thing, it was a force, a pull, a lure, a seduction that never stopped. And now it would wait for the next fool who came seeking riches, seeking power. The cave didn't need to chase them. It only needed to wait. The gold would call them, just as it had called him. And one by one, they would come. They would reach for it, believing they could control it, believe they could escape. But there was no escape, only the endless, gnawing hunger. And when the cycle was complete, when the next soul had been claimed, they too would join the rest. Whispering, waiting, part of the gold, part of the curse. The darkness would never end. And as his consciousness began to fade into the endless void, he accepted it. This was his eternity now. And in the stillness, the cave waited for the next.